South Korea is Australia's fourth largest trading partner, sixth largest source market for international students, 10th largest source market for visitor arrivals, and 15th largest foreign investor. Now, Daniel Kim, while these statistics, of course, are impressive, you believe more Australian businesses should have Korea on their radar. Why?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, the stats are impressive, and there are many great partnerships between Australia and Korea which contribute to the stats. But the reality is that there are still many businesses in Australia that are not aware of the strategic importance of Korea to Australia, and they're not necessarily across the latest opportunities in the corridor. So I also strongly believe that both Australia and Korea are yet to realise the full potential of the bilateral relationship. So for me, there are probably 5 reasons why Australian businesses should have Korea on their radar. So let me just quickly go through each one. I mean, firstly, the bilateral relationship between Australia and Korea is underpinned by similar values, shared interests, and mutual respect. And it's actually quite timely to remember this, particularly as China increasingly seeks to flex its muscle in the region. But Korea fundamentally supports the rule of law and is EIU's #1 democracy in Asia. Korea and Australia actually have a very rich and robust relationship. And Australia was actually one of the first allies to respond in the Korean War, when more than 17,000 servicemen and women fought bravely to protect the South between 1950 and 1953, with 339 casualties. So a huge sacrifice, which is still deeply appreciated by Koreans today. So the point is that there is a level of intimacy in the relationship, and it's far more than just purely a transactional relationship of buyer and seller. So then the second reason for me is Korea and Australia, they are classic middle powers with similar sized economies and with a very high degree of complementarity. And that is increasing with time. So here in the state of Queensland, Korea has been a great ideal partner to help us transform some of the state's traditional industry pillars like agriculture, mining, education and tourism. But Korea has also been an ideal partner to help us develop some of our new emerging growth sectors like biomedical, renewable hydrogen, synthetic bio, resource recovery, and immersive technologies like AR and VR. Between the two economies, we have a free trade agreement, and the CAFTA, which came into force in December 2014, set a new gold standard for Australia's FTAs in terms of its quality and also its comprehensiveness. And now in its 7th year, the CAFTA continues to deliver tangible benefits to Australian exporters. The third reason why I think Australian businesses should have Korea on their radar is the opportunity to ride the Korean wave of popular culture, or Hallyu, as we refer to it in Korean, by partnering with Korea to develop new innovative products for the global market. So let me give you an example. While beef exports to Korea have been long-standing, a recent collaboration has seen a Queensland supplier of frozen beef to CJ Cheoljadang, one of the big food processors and food service companies in Korea, who under their BBGO brand have developed a yukgaejang, which is a spicy beef stew, as part of a HMR or home meal replacement meal, which has been incredibly popular, not just in the Korean market, but in Southeast Asia, and in particular Vietnam. So the fourth reason for me is that Korea is a great source of inspiration. So Korea's economic transformation post-Korean War has been described as the miracle on the Han River. And when you consider that Korea now is leading the world in terms of semiconductors and digital displays, shipbuilding, petrochems, autos, and other areas. It truly is inspirational. But Korea, of course, also is a great source of innovation. Regularly and constantly, Korea ranks first on Bloomberg's Innovation Index. And what Korea is doing around the commercialization of 5G and how that's fostering new 5G related industries like smart cities, autonomous vehicles, digital healthcare, and so on, it's impressive, and it's creating new opportunities in the corridor with Queensland. Look, the final reason for me why Australian businesses should have Korea on their radar is Korea's proven track record throughout the centuries, mind you, of overcoming political and economic adversity. Now, I'm confident that the resilience and the dynamism of the Korean people, which has served them so well in the past, will help them overcome the challenges of today and prosper into the future. Now, of course, Korea is one of a few countries that has suffered a significant outbreak of COVID-19 and contained it, all while keeping its borders open and all without imposing economically damaging lockdowns. And this is actually why the IMF recently in June revised their forecast for the Korean economy to contract only by 2% and not 7% as their initial forecast in April. So many hope, including myself, that Korea will be one of the early countries, perhaps in a second tier, to emerge from the pandemic.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Yeah, it's very interesting how different Korea's approach has been to COVID-19 compared to Australia. I'd like to also share your sentiment in that I'm keen to see both countries maximise the potential of the bilateral relationship. Do you have any final closing comments?
Well, look, for now, I'll finish by just saying that I really genuinely believe that now, even during this pandemic, is a great time to either take a first or a fresh look at the evolving or the new emerging opportunities in the corridor between Queensland and Korea. So in 2019, e-commerce accounted for 28% of all retail sales in Korea, making it the largest sales channel. And this percentage is forecast to grow to 38% by 2024. Michael Koken, how does Korean e-commerce compare to e-commerce markets in other countries?
E-commerce is a little bit of a come again buzzword at the moment, but Korea's e-commerce market is significant, not only in its size, but also in its sophistication. So last year alone, Korean e-commerce recorded over US $100 billion in sale, which actually makes it the 5th largest in the world and on a trajectory to either be the 4th or even the 3rd largest in the next few years. Now, as you just mentioned, it's already the largest retail sales channel in Korea. And in fact, over 61% of those online sales occur over mobile. So it actually makes Korea one of the largest markets in the world as well for mobile e-commerce. Now, this rapid uptake of e-commerce in Korea has actually fueled the birth of significant local startups. And as it stands, over half of the 10 unicorns in Korea are actually involved in some form or in some way or another in online retail.
So Michael, how is it that Amazon doesn't have a local presence in Korea?
To put it quite simply, Coupang. Now, based on market share, Coupang is the largest of the Korean platforms and has been valued at over $9 billion US. Now, Coupang, as the name suggests, actually started out as a coupon-based sales site. So for an Australian, that can be something like Groupon. However, over the years, Coupang shifted their model and it now operates similar to how Amazon might operate. That is an open platform approach with direct ownership of logistics centres and last mile delivery services. Now, Coupang is not the only significant e-commerce platform in Korea. Other players include Gmarket, 11th Street, Auction, and We Make Price. And in some way, they've all contributed to keeping out Amazon and other foreign players. Now, Coupang have succeeded because as local players, they cater specifically for Korean consumers, and they've recognised early the importance of investing in their own logistics. Something like 99% of orders placed on the site are delivered within 1 day. If you can imagine, that's quite unbelievable. And impressively, they deliver 3.3 million items each day.
Wow. So, Michael, how can Queensland exporters access the Korean e-commerce market?
Yeah, so there are a variety of pathways. I've defined them into 4 categories: traditional, formal cross-border, group purchasing cross-border, and informal cross-border. Now, of these 4, I want to focus on traditional and formal cross-border because these are the 2 pathways which an exporter will be able to have a level of control over, and the 2 that offer invaluable market insight, feedback, and experience. The other 2 models, which I won't cover, quite frankly, they could exist without an exporter even being aware. So to start with, I'll cover off traditional e-commerce, which actually isn't too different from traditional export. The key difference in this channel is that the Korean partner or importer will focus its sales and marketing efforts through online channels. Now, under this pathway, shipping will usually be bulk sea freight, which is because the importer or the e-commerce platform will need the stock on hand, as we spoke about, for that kind of same-day delivery or overnight delivery service. Now, just like regular export, it does mean that products will have to go through a product registration process, have the same protocol restraints and customs issues that may come through normal export. However, an exporter can work with an importer to work through these. Now, this pathway is probably most suited towards exporters with scale and those involved in packaged food and beverage. So if I could just now cover off cross-border e-commerce, which in Korean is actually called jikgu. It differs in that a Korean service provider or buyer will in fact actually be based in Australia and purchase the product much the same way as a local distributor or stockist might. So for an exporter, they'll actually just ship orders, usually on consignment, to a Korean buyer based in Australia with a warehouse. Now that Korean seller will then put these products onto multiple e-commerce sites in Korea, such as Coupang. This Australian-based Korean partner will handle the pick packing. It'll do its air freight with a trusted Korean logistics partner. They also handle all the back-end requirements to list on these platforms, and they'll create detailed description with images of the product in Korean, which, as you can imagine, is going to be essential for a Korean consumer. Now, cross-border is also good in that it can help bypass some of those market entry barriers that I spoke about. So things like tariffs or custom restrictions, they can be bypassed through cross-border e-commerce as long as the volumes are small. However, it sounds great, but for an exporter, it does have its limits in scale. And consignment, as you know, isn't always going to be an option. So with that, it actually suits smaller exporters or those with products that would encounter customs issues. However, it provides an opportunity for testing the market, building a consumer base, gaining access to consumer feedback and insights to help tailor the product. Of course, with increasing sales and brand awareness, exporters may be able then to transition from a cross-border model to a traditional export model.
That's great, Michael. So can you give us an example of an e-commerce platform in Korea that you're currently working with?
Yeah, I certainly can, with much pleasure. We have worked with Queensland exporters and their Korean importers to access a premium grocery e-commerce platform that's called Market Curly. Now, Market Curly is unique in Korea for its focus on premium imported goods. And the site, as opposed to an open platform like Coupang, is actually highly curated. So they personally taste and select all products that are listed on the site. They also have their own logistics center, and they have a unique cold storage supply chain to ensure products are delivered fast and fresh. Now, Market Curly are famous in Korea because they actually started the overnight delivery service. So if you can imagine, you could order by 11 p.m. at night, and the next morning it would be delivered by 7 a.m., which is quite amazing. For the exporter, the pathway to market, as I've explained, was actually the same as traditional export. So we worked to introduce the Queensland exporter to a Korean importer who had a strong relationship with Market Curly. And currently, I'm proud to say that we now have over 8 different Queensland products on the site.
How has COVID-19 impacted your clients' e-commerce strategies?
So firstly, on the Korean side, for these platforms, COVID-19 had a similar impact as it did in Australia, in that there was a mad rush to buy not quite toilet paper, but to buy other products. And so in that moment of time, some of these Korean e-commerce platforms actually had to shut off orders, such was the demand. Now, they've also had other stumbling blocks in that these logistics centres, which they all own and operate, also had their own issues with some of the workers contracting COVID-19, which, as you can imagine, kind of led consumers to maybe feel a little bit apprehensive from ordering from these e-commerce platforms. However, despite those barriers, COVID-19 has accelerated e-commerce in Korea even further, and the level of demand for food and beverage, health and wellness, and what they've been dubbed home economy items via e-commerce has boomed. So for our exporters that were already positioned on Market Curly and other platforms to begin with, are now set to benefit. If I can touch on the Australian side, COVID-19 has had a massive impact on regular air freight channels. So with no commercial flights between Australia and Korea, there isn't any regular air freight. So for exporters who are hoping to try and access cross-border without one of these dedicated cross-border partners, at the moment, the simple fact is there isn't any air freight for them to utilise. And this is going to be an ongoing issue, we can imagine, until international travel restarts. So it really shows the importance to either work with a traditional importer for that traditional e-commerce platform, or with a formal cross-border partner who already has established air freight channels. Now, lastly, if I can just touch on the fact that for all of us, travel is going to be off the agenda for the foreseeable future. So we believe in Korea, this could lead to an increase in demand in imported goods as they kind of seek to try to travel without actually traveling. And so we think this really bodes well for our exporters looking to access the Korean market via e-commerce. The Republic of Korea has been a long-standing investor in Australia and has helped build the economic capacity of the nation. Now, in the last 3 years, the state of Queensland has attracted almost $2 billion from Korea, which is quite remarkable when one considers the total investment stock from Korea into Australia, as at 2019, stood at $31 billion. Daniel Kim, what's the secret to this success?
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm not sure there is a secret, but certainly the diversity of Queensland economy helps a lot. It is important to point out that Queensland has been a beneficiary of Korean investment for more than 4 decades. Initially, it was by the strategic investors like LG International, POSCO, Corres, all whom invested minority equity stakes in mining projects for offtake. In more recent years, we saw Kogas's sort of similar play, but on a much larger project in Gladstone LNG. In recent years, we've also seen Lotte International enter the market. Initially, 6 years ago, from a trading perspective, but it was fantastic to see them last year invest and acquire the Sandalwood beef feedlot just outside of Dalby, with a view to trying to maximise and capture more value in their supply chain. But in that $2 billion, which you referred to, Michael, there was 2 very significant reinvestments, if you like, from Korea Zinc's Sun Metals. So, of course, Korea Zinc first established their Sun Metals zinc refinery in Townsville back in 1997, and has been making a significant contribution to the regional economy up there for many years. But it was wonderful 2 years ago to see Sun Metals develop their own 125 megawatt solar project to help feed their refinery. But not long after that, they also made a very significant announcement to invest a further $377 million to expand the capacity of the refinery. So other notable investments then included in that sum that you mentioned, Michael, includes Merit's support for EMR Capital as part of their acquisition of 80% stake in the Kestrel hard coke and coal mine. We also saw the Korean Teachers Pension Fund acquired the Green Square South commercial property in Fortitude Valley, just in the CBD fringe of Brisbane. The other investment was Hanwha Energy was part of a Korean consortium which acquired Bark Calden, a solar project, a couple of years ago. And more recently, we saw Korea's Kosdaq listed Macrogen invest in as part of Microba's Series B funding round. So for me, beyond the value of the investment, what's been really exciting and very pleasing to see is the broadening of the sectors where the Korean strategics have invested into, including biomedical and including renewable energy. And it's also been great to welcome new financial and institutional investors from Korea into Queensland for the first time.
So obviously COVID-19 has impacted investment globally, but specifically, how has it impacted Korean outbound investment in the first half of 2020?
Well, based on merger market data, the value of outbound M&A activity was about $3.4 billion across 28 deals in the first half, and that was down 26% compared to the same period last year. So the global market uncertainty caused by the pandemic certainly has had an impact on Korean investor appetite and activity. But having said that, Korean corporates did complete a number of cross-border deals in the first half, including Celltrion and their acquisition of Takeda Pharmaceuticals over-the-counter and prescription pharma products for about $270 million US. But looking a bit closer to home, we strongly welcomed the announcement by a Korean consortium, including Hana Financial Investment, Samchali Asset Management, and Korea's East West Power, on signing a joint development agreement on a ready-to-build 162 megawatt solar project, the Kolumbula Solar Farm, in the Western Downs region of Queensland.
That sounds quite positive. So, in your opinion, what's the outlook for Korean outbound investment for the second half of 2020 and further beyond?
So, despite the global headwinds, I believe there is some cause for optimism. The pandemic certainly, hasn't stopped me and my team from pitching a number of investment opportunities to our Korean investor clients, and we know that they're actively scanning various overseas markets for new opportunities. The rebound of outbound activity might be a little slow to start with. This will be due in part just to the current international travel restrictions, which will make it difficult, not impossible, to undertake site visits, for example, particularly for those investors that don't have a presence in Australia. One of the other challenges, of course, will be around matching valuation expectations between buyers and sellers. We expect some bidders perhaps to expect lower valuations during these challenging times. But sellers' expectations, on the other hand, might not have changed and could in fact be higher if they're operating in some of these hot sectors like biopharmaceuticals, for example. But look, the other cause for optimism stems from the outcome of the general election in Korea in April 2020. So President Moon, his Democratic Party, which was in a minority government situation, they won a supermajority in the National Assembly. And so what this means for President Moon is that he has now avoided the risk of becoming a lame duck president in the remaining years of his presidency. But what it means is that he can push full steam ahead on his key policy agenda, which includes the hydrogen roadmap, but also his recently announced Green New Deal, which commits US $9.5 billion over the next 5 years to triple renewable power generation in Korea.
That sounds really promising. Could you perhaps maybe touch on some of the industry sectors and investment themes that you and the team at TRQ Korea are focused on?
Well, as you've probably guessed, based on my earlier remarks, biomedical is a priority sector for us right now, and we're actively working with a number of Korean biotechs at the moment. We also have a number of utility scale renewable energy projects, both solar and wind with battery, and also a couple of pumped hydro opportunities, which are very promising. Renewable hydrogen is again of keen interest to both sides, and watch this space. There will be a very exciting announcement on that one very soon. But we're also working on a few opportunities in battery chemicals. So in particular, the cobalt sulfate and nickel sulfate, supplying into the Korean electric vehicle battery manufacturers, who themselves are aggressively expanding their manufacturing capacity to meet the soaring demand globally for electric vehicles. One of the other themes that we like is around protein, and so that's in the sort of traditional sense around beef, and following Lotte's investment in Sandalwood last year, we're looking at a number of opportunities in that sort of beef midstream, so more feedlot, maybe processing, probably less so upstream at farm, but midstream we think is quite promising. But we're also looking at alternative proteins as a new category of opportunity for the Korean market. I mean, worldwide, the market for these meat alternatives was valued at a little over $4 billion back in 2017, but that's estimated to reach more than $7.5 billion in 2025. So we're looking to ride that or jump on that bandwagon. And earlier this year, it was interesting that Mira Asset actually invested in Impossible Foods, which is a US-based startup specializing in plant-based meat. So that's one thing we're looking at. Another one which we really like is around the circular economy. We envisage that there will be some, structural shifts in particularly resource recovery in Australia in the next 12 to 18 months. And we're actually working on a very exciting project right now, which would be an Australian first, which looks to divert plastic from landfill to be manufacturing, higher value-added products. So that's quite exciting, and that's a partnership between Korea and a big player here in Australia. The other area is around infrastructure, in particular, sort of greenfield infrastructure projects, and it ranges from sort of civil infrastructure PPP projects, which are of great interest to kind of the tier one EPC contractors in Korea, which will invest minority equity, but also other projects like Copper String 2.0, which is a 1,100 kilometre transmission line proposed to link Townsville and the grid on the east coast to Mount Isa. There are a number of Korean key equipment suppliers that are looking to participate in the project, and as part of that, leverage a broader funding solution out of Korea, in particular, the export credit agencies. So I suppose, yes, some very exciting opportunities in our pipeline.
Korea has outlined some ambitious 2030 targets for K-Bio, namely to achieve 6% global market share, up from the current 1.8%, to generate US $50 billion in exports and create almost 1.1 million jobs. Now, Daniel Kim, what is driving this dramatic growth in approved biologic therapies?
Yeah, so Michael, I think it's a really good question, and it's probably easiest if I respond with a few key statistics. So the first being the global aging population. So this is aged over 65. It's forecast to increase from 15% to 25% from 2010 to 2040. So as a result, the share of the world's biopharmaceutical prescriptions is forecast to increase from 17% to 31% from 2010 to 2024. So both will have a huge impact on global healthcare expenditure. So in the OECD alone, healthcare expenditure is expected to increase from 11% to 30% of GDP from 2016 to 2040. So the experience in Europe has shown that early adoption of biosimilars can achieve significant savings and also allow greater access to more patients.
Just how exactly is Korea positioned to capitalise on this?
Well, Korea is positioned very well due to its capacity to produce these biopharmaceuticals, which currently stands at 520,000 litres. So that's second only to the US with 1.8 million litres, and ahead of Germany, which has 270,000 litres. So one of the biggest players in Korea, Samsung Biologics, on their own have a manufacturing capacity of 364,000 litres. And when I visited Samsung Biologics with the Queensland Premier at the end of 2018, we witnessed firsthand the scale of Samsung Biologics' facility and the way they had lined up the 10,000 litre bioreactors kind of one after each other. It reminded me more of a beer brewery than anything else. But it is hard to believe that, Samsung Biologics was only founded 9 years ago. But it's a great example of the speed and agility in which these conglomerate groups can operate, particularly when they commit to developing these new future growth engines. And when we met with Samsung Biologics, they weren't just proud of having the largest manufacturing capacity in Korea. But what they explained is that in terms of how they compared to some of their far more established global competitors, Samsung's capex by capacity was smaller. Their cost of goods sold per gram was lower, and their construction timetable was shorter. So it was very impressive. But beyond these big players like Samsung Biologics and SK Biopharmaceuticals and Celltrion, the Korean biotech ecosystem is thriving and very strongly supported by venture capital. And in 2019, VCs invested in over 300 biotechs, which was up 27% on the previous year. So while Korea is positioned very well in many respects, what's interesting is that their share of patents relating to biopharmaceuticals is still relatively low. It's only 6%. And that's compared to the US at 36% and China at 24%.
It sounds like Korea is really positioning itself well. How is the Korean government supporting this K-bio movement and in particular biotechs to boost new drug discovery?
With a lot of money is the answer. So the Korean government has increased its R&D funding for Korean biotechs from $2.6 billion to $4 billion by 2025. And just yesterday, the Ministry of SMEs and Startups just announced a new fund, a Smart Korea Fund is what they're calling it, which is equivalent of about 900 million US this year to foster startups in 3 areas, and one of those 3 includes bio.
So then the billion-dollar question is there an opportunity for Queensland to partner with Korea?
So in short, the answer is yes. And, as more and more biologics are given a fast track designation or a breakthrough therapy status, these biopharma companies are looking for partners with approaches and solutions to enable accelerated development timelines and faster paths to clinic for their breakthrough molecules. So we're very fortunate that in Queensland, we've got the capability to provide that end-to-end solution from bench to bedside to market. And it's through our CDMOs, our contract development manufacturing organizations like Patheon, like Luina Bio, who can all support the very small batch manufacturing for the purposes of early stage clinical trials. Of course, we've got some great contract research organizations that can help with those clinical trials as well. And again, there's a number of opportunities we're working on right now with Patheon, with the likes of CNS and others here in Brisbane. But what's actually really encouraging is even as recently as last month, I was speaking with the CEO of a COSDAQ listed biotech, and they're actually showing some early interest in undertaking joint development and research on new drugs with our research institutes here in Queensland, like QIMR, Berghofer and TRI and others. So yes, very encouraging. So for me, if you're a research institute or if you're a CRO or a CDMO here in Queensland and you'd like to understand more about the opportunities in and with Korea, please get in touch with Michael or myself.
So in June 2017, President Moon Jae-in described Korea's youth unemployment as a potential national disaster and warned a generation of young Koreans could become a lost generation. Daniel Kim, it's been 3 years since then. What's the rate of Korea's youth unemployment currently?
So Michael, the official rate of Korea's youth unemployment, it peaked at 11.6% in 2018 and has declined slightly since then to 10.2% in May this year during the pandemic. However, when you include Korean youth who have the potential to be economically active, together with youth who are employed on a casual, albeit kind of unstable basis. So from their perspective, they don't have that sort of job security and feel like they could be made redundant at any time. So when you take that into account, the effective rate of youth unemployment in Korea is currently at an all-time high of 26.3% as at May this year. So that's more than 1 in 4 young Koreans.
That's quite an alarming statistic. Why has Korea's youth unemployment been so high for so long?
Yeah, good question. So there are many structural and societal reasons that contribute to Korea's soaring youth unemployment. So firstly, I mean, the job opportunities in Korea, they have declined over recent years. the previous president also extended the retirement age, which, so for every vice president that stays in a job, there's probably 3 to 4 graduates that probably are kept out of a job. But it doesn't help that Korean students and parents share a near universal goal of admission into Korea's SKY universities. So this is Seoul, this is Korea, and Yonsei universities. In order to secure what we describe as a gold collar job, namely a doctor or a dentist, or a white collar job with, say, one of the conglomerate groups. But of course, the problem is that the demand, for these prime university positions far outstrips supply. So the other problem is that there's a huge salary gap between Korea's large conglomerate groups and small to medium enterprises. The Bank of Korea commissioned a working paper on this, and they found that the wage gap was as high as 21%. So as a result, these young Koreans who are seeking work, they choose to stay unemployed for longer, hoping to secure these higher paying jobs. Or they return to uni to try and obtain another degree to boost their credentials. The uncomfortable truth, of course, is that another academic qualification is unlikely to actually improve their job readiness.
So just on that theme of job readiness, maybe could you give an example of how Australian students in comparison boost their employability?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If I start with Australian industry and then I'll work backwards, industry here in Australia, is increasingly looking beyond qualifications and focusing on employability. So namely, the practical skills which enable new recruits to be effective from day one. And so as an example, I've noticed that some, for example, Bachelor of Engineering graduates from the top tier universities here in Australia, undertake a short course in, say, project management at TAFE in order to enhance their job readiness. It is interesting that in Australia, exposure to vocational education and training, or VET, it starts at a very early age. So in 2018, actually 54% of Australian youth aged 15 to 19 had participated in some form of VET as a real catalyst, which to help them secure meaningful work. So it's different, but clearly, in Australia, we've seen the use of vocational education to help secure meaningful work for the first time, to upgrade into a better job, or to access a pathway into university.
So you've talked about the Australian students, but what is the experience like for international students undertaking VET courses in Australia?
Yeah, so in 2019, a little bit, just under 280,000 international students, which included more than 16,000 Korean students, undertook a VET course, a vocational education and training course in Australia, to develop their practical skills and, more often than not, apply those in a real world context as part of an internship. Incredibly, 85% of those international VET graduates actually secured employment in Australia or undertook further study. So that in itself is quite amazing. But what's even more incredible is that the median annual salary for these international VET students after training in Australia, the median salary was 41,700 Australian dollars, which in Korean won is about 34 million Korean won. So that actually compares very favorably when you consider the starting salaries at Samsung Electronics, which is 37 million, at Kakao, which is 31 million, and even Korea Electric Power Corporation is 30 million. So it's actually higher than that.
I'm sure you could probably name a lot, but could you pick out just one example of a Korean student who has had a positive experience here in Queensland?
There are many, but one student in particular who really impressed and inspired me recently was a student called Song Jinmi, and I don't think she would mind me sharing her story with you. So she originally traveled to Australia from Korea to study beauty, but through a journey of assisted self-discovery with TAFE, she actually identified her true passion. She completed a Certificate 3 in heavy commercial vehicle mechanical technology at TAFE, and undertook an internship at Daimler Trucks, and is currently working full-time on the Gold Coast and loving it. So it's a great story. And the question I ask myself is, how many more Jinmis are out there in Korea?
That really is a wonderful story. If I could just bring it back to our original opening, what will it take for Korea to overcome its youth unemployment crisis?
It's, again, there isn't any easy fix. I've spent a lot of time here in Korea visiting a number of Korea's leading university colleges, and the specialized, including the Meister high schools. And overall, I'm optimistic that Korea's vet sector, through even closer alignment with industry in Korea and greater engagement with international partners, say in Queensland, can play a pivotal role in helping Korean youth find their passion, develop the practical skills required for them to secure meaningful work, if not pursue their dreams. So for me, the quality outcomes that are being achieved in Australia, are indicative of the incredible opportunity that awaits Korea, if society and industry can constructively challenge their own perceptions of vocational education and training. Frankly, it should not be seen as a lesser pursuit to university, but rather as a key enabler to boost young Koreans' employability in the domestic and the global job market. So if you're a Queensland vet provider, whether you be public or private, and you want to understand more about the opportunities in and with Korea, please contact Michael or myself.